Caleb Vance squinted against the harsh glare of the triple suns overhead as he stepped onto the bustling thoroughfare of Triara's main market district. At 29 years old, he looked perpetually stuck between scruffy frontier explorer and curious child, his short dark brown hair standing in half-hearted spikes where sweat and dust had matted it. He had green eyes, flecked with amber, remnants of his father's side, though no one had told him that since he was too young to remember. A faint scar slashed across his left eyebrow, and a few more decorated his forearms, each a silent witness to the scrapes he had endured as a scavenger. His figure was lean, with long muscles stretched tight beneath a well-worn jacket, and he moved with the restless energy of someone never quite satisfied with standing still. As he walked, he tapped a nervous beat with his fingertips against his thigh, an ingrained habit from the days he'd fooled around with a second-hand drum kit in a forgotten colony outpost. He had come to Triara with the hope of finding worthwhile salvage in the fabled ship graveyard that lay just outside the city limits. Rumor had it that merchant vessels from every corner of the galaxy made port here, and inevitably, some never left. Caleb's skill at repairing electronics, whether human-made or alien, paid well enough, but deep down, he wrestled with a crippling fear of mediocrity. He was good at improvising fixes on just about anything with a circuit board, and he prided himself on scrounging solutions out of near trash. Yet this life of bouncing from colony to colony, never planting roots, left him feeling like he would vanish without ever making a mark on the universe. He yearned for something more, something that would prove he mattered. He wound his way along stalls, draped with brilliant silks, passing by an exotic fruit vendor whose sweet-smelling wares made his stomach growl. All around, alien species bartered in voices that ranged from lilting chimes to guttural croaks. Metal arches spanned overhead, festooned with glowing orbs that swirled in a constant display of fleeting colors. The murmur of commerce and the clang of machinery filled the air. Caleb brushed a layer of sweat off his brow. The triple-sun climate was punishing, and each step kicked up swirls of iridescent dust that clung to his boots. He tried not to cough as his throat felt dry as a bone. Looking around for a shady spot, he spied a precarious intersection up ahead. A few local vehicles floating on anti-grav pads zipped past with little regard for pedestrian safety. At that very moment, he noticed a frail figure on the curb. She was clearly alien, shorter than him by a head, wearing a tattered cloak that concealed most of her face. She was edging forward as though she couldn't see well, or perhaps she was too timid to step into the traffic. People gave her a cursory glance, then hurried on. Something about her hunched posture, the trembling in her small hands, called out to him. Without really thinking, he walked over. "Do you need help crossing?" he asked, not sure if she could understand his standard. She hesitated, but slowly tilted her face up, revealing pale bluish skin and wide eyes filmed with age. She nodded. Her voice, when it emerged, was soft and raspy. "Thank you," she said, in broken but decipherable standard. He smiled, took her by the arm gently, and guided her across the street. The vehicles slowed marginally, and a few horns blared in annoyance, but Caleb navigated them both to the other side unscathed. When they were safely out of the flow of traffic, the old alien woman patted his hand in gratitude. Her gnarled fingers were cold to the touch, and her voice carried a curious trembling, as though she was both grateful and awed by him. "Kindness," she said, "not so common. You are good." "Just being decent," Caleb replied, shrugging. "Hope you have a nice day." He turned to leave, but she grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. Her gaze pinned him in place, her eyes shining with an odd clarity that belied her frailty. He caught a flash of something in those pupils, like starlight. Then she said something in her own language, a string of words that he could not understand, followed by a solemn nod. The moment felt charged, as though a presence beyond the old woman lingered in the air. Then she stepped back, withdrew into her cloak, and hobbled away, leaving Caleb in the swirl of dust and chatter. He was left blinking, uncertain why he felt so strangely unsettled. Shaking it off, he moved on, deciding to check the spare parts shops on the next street. Yet a faint whisper persisted at the back of his mind, telling him there was more to that encounter than met the eye. He spent the rest of the afternoon haggling with scrappers. His anxious habit of finger-tapping flared up, the rhythmic drumming keeping him calm as he bartered for a power cell. Even as he rummaged through old circuit boards, he couldn't banish the vivid image of those eyes. Evening descended, though one of Triara's suns lingered at a lower angle, casting elongated shadows across the market. The air was cooler, and the orbs overhead shifted to a warm glow. Caleb decided it was time to find a place to rest, but he hadn't taken 10 steps before a ripple of alarm shot through the crowd. At first, it was a distant scream, then a hush, followed by the pounding of footsteps. Caleb spotted movement at the far edge of the market. People were scattering, toppling stalls, rushing away from something. Soldiers, no, mercenaries, by the look of their mismatched armor, were shoving through the throng, brandishing energy weapons. Caleb ducked behind a shuttered kiosk. He had no intention of tangling with armed thugs. He knew when to keep his head down. But as he crouched there, watching the mercenaries fan out, his eyes caught sight of someone else. A tall figure with sapphire-blue skin, sleek and gleaming under the market lights, was pinned behind a half-collapsed stall. She had tight, form-fitting clothes that clung to her lithe body, cobalt and black lines running along her legs and arms, and it was instantly clear she was not a typical bystander. A cascade of shimmering blue hair framed her face, accentuating the startling gold of her slit-pupil eyes, which glowed like molten metal. Even amid the chaos, her cat-like ears flicked in agitation, and whisker-like markings near her cheeks trembled ever so slightly. She was trying to remain hidden, but her gaze darted around, searching for an escape route. Caleb guessed she was cornered. One of the mercenaries barked a command, and another answered, training a weapon on her position. He had no reason to get involved. If anything, helping might earn him a blaster shot. Still, the pang of conscience tugged at him. He'd already helped one alien that day. Why not make it two? Besides, something about her appearance was mesmerizing. Then he noticed her ears twitch, as if picking up the mercenary's footsteps. She exuded tension, readiness, but she was clearly outnumbered. He rummaged in his belt pouch for a small device that he used to jam security signals. It was a homemade contraption, one he'd cobbled together from spare parts. With a flick of a switch, he hoped to disrupt the mercenary's helmet comms for at least a few crucial seconds. Taking a breath, he sprinted from his cover, slid behind the same stall she was hiding behind, and whispered, "Need a distraction." She turned sharply, her golden eyes narrowing. Up close, she was even more striking. Her cat ears twitched in obvious suspicion, but a flash of gratitude passed through her gaze. She hesitated, then nodded once, an unspoken alliance. Caleb counted to 3 under his breath, and when he reached 3, he activated the jammer and stood up, waving his arms like a lunatic. "Hey!" he shouted. "Looking for me?" The device crackled in his palm. Immediately the mercenaries yelled in confusion, pressing the sides of their helmets as static hissed in their earpieces. The mysterious alien woman sprang into action. Moving with the speed and elegance of a predator, she vaulted over the stall, her tight suit shimmering under the overhead orbs. Caleb felt a rush of air as she passed him, claws unsheathed from her fingertips, so quick he hardly registered it. She dispatched one mercenary with a precise strike to his wrist, disarming him. Another swung the butt of a rifle at her, but she ducked. She was clearly trained, every motion a blur of fluid intensity. Caleb crouched too, making himself a smaller target. Then she grabbed his arm, pulling him into her sprint away from the chaos, weaving past fleeing civilians and up a side alley. The mercenaries, still reeling from their disrupted communications, were left scrambling to regroup. They didn't stop running until they reached a deserted side street. Night had fallen now, at least by Triara's definition of night, which meant two of the suns had dipped behind the horizon, leaving only the faint glow of the smallest. Neon signs reflected on puddles, painting the walls in flickering pink and green. Panting, she finally released her grip on his arm. He steadied himself, blinking away the adrenaline. Her tall, feline ears flicked a few times, the dark blue fur shimmering faintly. Her whisker-like markings curved along the sides of her cheeks, accentuating the proud angles of her face. Her gold eyes locked on his with an intensity that made him swallow hard. In that moment, he noticed how the body-hugging suit accentuated her toned physique. Lean muscle and athletic grace. A faint hum came from her chest, almost like a low purr, but he wasn't sure if she was aware of it. "Thank you," she said at last, her voice both melodic and edged with caution. "I did not expect anyone to interfere." He managed a crooked grin. "I didn't expect to become a target for hired guns. Seems we both had a weird day." Her expression softened slightly, and her cat ears flicked in what he was beginning to guess was a sign of relief. "I am Lyselle, and you are—" Caleb Vance." He forced his hand out in greeting. She looked at it for a second, then slowly extended her own. Her fingers were slim, with short, pointed claws at the tips. Despite her feline attributes, her palm felt normal enough in his. Their handshake lingered just a moment longer than necessary. She frowned as she examined him, as though trying to piece together something that didn't fit. He realized then how she was scanning him, like she was measuring his sincerity or searching for hidden motives. Finally, she released his hand and glanced over her shoulder, ears flattening briefly. "I must go," she said, voice urgent. "They'll be after me soon enough. And you should be careful. They might think we're working together." He didn't have time to argue before she dashed off, vaulting up onto a low rooftop with startling agility, then slipping out of sight. Caleb stood there, heart pounding. He should have walked away. That would have been the smart thing to do, yet somehow he knew he was now entangled in something that stretched far beyond a random alley scuffle. The next morning he woke in a cheap hostel on the outskirts of the city with a throbbing headache. The sudden burst of adrenaline the night before had left him drained. Rubbing his temples, he recalled the events. The old alien woman, the mercenaries, the feline-like Lyselle. He mused that maybe it was time to leave Triara, yet even as he formed the thought, a strong tug of curiosity bound him to the city. He hurried to the ship graveyard after grabbing a quick meal. The rumor was that you could find anything there if you looked hard enough, including scraps of highly advanced alien technology. He took comfort in the methodical process of scavenging. Hours passed as he rummaged through rusted hulls and piles of twisted metal. It was good, honest work, the kind that let him focus on immediate goals, find valuable components, earn some credits, and then figure out what the next step in life might be. He knelt next to what looked like the remains of a shuttle engine. Using a small pry bar, he opened a casing. The interior was half melted, but he managed to extract a data core that might fetch a decent price if it still functioned. Tucking it into his bag, he rose to continue the search. Suddenly, a voice behind him startled him so badly he nearly dropped the core. "You are resourceful," it said. He spun and saw Lyselle perched atop a half-buried cargo crate. Her lithe form was silhouetted by the light of the single sun overhead. Her cat ears flicked in a slight breeze, and her long blue hair fell to one side in a shimmering cascade. She wore the same tight suit, though he noticed small tears and scratches in it, as if she'd been through more scrapes since they last met. He exhaled sharply. "You nearly gave me a heart attack." She hopped down, landing without a sound. "I needed to find you." There was a tremor in her voice, a tension that made his skin prickle. She stepped closer, whisker-like markings glowing faintly in the midday light. "Those men from yesterday, they're still searching. I am being hunted, and you may be as well." He recalled the old woman's parting words, that cryptic, penetrating stare. "This is about more than just random mercenaries, isn't it?" She nodded, the gesture weighted. "I am heir to the leadership of my people, the Elenari. My family once held a seat of power in a distant star system. There has been turmoil. I came here seeking sanctuary. Clearly that was foolish. My enemies followed me." Caleb rubbed at the back of his neck. "So you're royalty? That's not something I expected." He studied her face, trying to piece together how someone so poised and deadly could also be so vulnerable. "Why me? Why track me down?" Her gaze flickered. "I recognize the old woman you helped in the street. She's my grandmother, though she conceals her identity. Our culture has a tradition. If an outsider aids an elder of the royal line in a moment of need, there is a bond formed by that kindness, a symbolic bond." She hesitated. "It designates you as a sort of champion or protector. In times of crisis, that bond is invoked to validate claims. Some interpret it as a claim for the throne." He laughed, a short, disbelieving bark. "That's absurd. I helped an old lady cross the street. I didn't sign up for any monarchy claim." Lyselle's gold eyes narrowed with a hint of amusement. "Nor did I think I would meet a human who would step into this. Yet here we are. My grandmother never does anything by accident. If she chose you, then she saw something in you. And now, the faction opposing me will not hesitate to eliminate you in order to weaken my position." A slow, cold realization settled over him. He was in way over his head. Yet a spark of something else flared in his chest. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the simmering sense that at last fate had thrown him a challenge bigger than he'd ever imagined. "So what do we do?" She tilted her head, her feline ears flattening for a moment in anxiety before standing upright again. "We leave Triara now. I have an ally who can get us off-world to a place where I can try to secure my rightful position without these constant attempts on my life. You can come, or you can stay and risk them finding you alone." He swallowed. "I'm not sure I have a choice." She gave him a long look. "You always have a choice. But if you come with me, you might just save both our lives." Her eyes softened slightly, and he noticed the faintest flick of her tail. Apparently, she had a sleek blue tail that curled behind her ankles. "I also would appreciate not facing them alone." He sighed, shoulders sagging, and shot a glance at the twisted metal labyrinth around them. He had yearned for more than this roving scavenger's life after all. Maybe the universe was giving him exactly what he'd asked for. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's do this." They found their way back into the city under the cloak of early dusk. It was risky. Lyselle insisted she needed to meet someone in the upper spires of Triara. By then, the sky had turned a hazy purple, the last sunlight glinting off the sleek architecture. A labyrinth of towers spiraled upward, interconnected by catwalks and illuminated by the neon glow of signage. Caleb felt the sense of a strange hush, as if the city itself was braced for something. Lyselle led him to a service elevator behind a locked gate. He knelt, hacking the console with a small device he'd built from the data cores he'd collected. A spark, a hiss, and the gate rattled open. They rode the elevator in silence. She stared down at the city lights, her whiskers twitching with anxiety. He suppressed the urge to soothe her, figuring such an intimate gesture might not be well received. But he felt a pull toward her that he couldn't explain. Her presence stirred him, a combination of her regal bearing, her feline grace, and the quiet vulnerability she tried so hard to hide. They reached a dimly lit corridor high above the streets. Silhouetted by the evening lights was another figure, a male alien of the same general species as Lyselle, also blue-skinned, though with different markings around his eyes. He stood, dipping his head respectfully to Lyselle. "My lady," he said, "I didn't think you'd arrive so soon." She introduced him as Tovan, one of the last loyal retainers of her family. He cast a curious look at Caleb, but said nothing. The walls were polished metal, the floor humming with the faint vibrations of power conduits beneath. Lyselle guided him to a recessed door where she tapped a discreet code. The door slid open with a hiss, revealing a small chamber that overlooked the entire city. It was a private lounge of sorts, with plush seating near a transparent wall. Instead, he stepped forward and explained that a ship waited at a private hangar, fueled and ready. If they wanted to slip past Triara's watchful port authorities, they needed to leave immediately. Lyselle turned to Caleb, meeting his gaze. "Let's go," she said softly. Caleb nodded, but an uneasy feeling pooled in his stomach. Tovan opened a secured crate and handed them each a small contraption, a personal shield generator that snapped around the wrist. Lyselle affixed hers carefully. Caleb's was a bit snug, but he managed. They were heading to the door when a thunderous crash sounded from the far side of the corridor, followed by shouts. Tovan cursed under his breath, reaching for his sidearm. A squad of mercenaries stormed in, and an all-too-familiar figure emerged behind them. Caleb recognized the soldier from the market. He wore battered patchwork armor, his lips curled in a sneer, eyes glinting with a predatory hunger as he spotted Lyselle. "You're not going anywhere, princess," he spat, leveling his gun. "Your grandmother's bounty on your safe return is dwarfed by what the opposition is willing to pay me to ensure you never ascend the throne." Tovan lunged forward, firing a shot that sizzled across the corridor. Blaster fire erupted in a deafening exchange. Caleb dove behind an overturned table, fumbling with the shield generator's activation switch. Lyselle darted behind a pillar, her golden eyes blazing with fury. She signaled something to Tovan, but the retainer had already been hit, staggering to the floor with a cry of pain. The mercenaries advanced, peppering the area with energy bolts. Caleb's heart hammered. This was too real, too dangerous. He tried to remember how to breathe, reminding himself he had jerry-rigged countless gadgets to break open sealed compartments or override security. Perhaps he could do something similar now. Another swung the butt of his rifle, smashing it against her side. She stumbled, letting out a guttural hiss, her cat ears flattening. Caleb rose, reflexes firing. He tackled the mercenary from behind, ignoring the spike of pain in his shoulder. They rolled across the floor. The soldier was stronger, bigger, but Caleb scrambled for the man's gun. A scuffle later, a bright flash, and the mercenary collapsed. Panting, Caleb turned to Lyselle. She pressed a hand to her ribs, breathing hard. He spotted a cluster of conduits along the ceiling, their faint hum suggesting a power line overhead. Fishing a device from his pack, he lobbed it at the junction box. It stuck. With a flick of a control in his hand, the device overloaded the lines, causing lights to flicker in a violent strobe. It bought them a few seconds of confusion. Lyselle sprang out from her pillar in a blur of movement, her claws slicing through the weapon arm of a mercenary. Her whisker markings glowed faintly, and her gold eyes flickered with relief when they landed on him. Tovan groaned on the floor. She hurried to him, her feline ears drooping in sorrow. He was alive, but badly wounded, a blaster burn across his midsection. Alarms shrieked throughout the corridor. "You two, get out!" Tovan gasped. "They know we're here. I'll slow them down as long as I can." Lyselle's ears flicked back in protest, but Tovan gripped her hand, managing a weak smile. They emerged onto a catwalk that spanned across a yawning gap between two towers, lit only by distant city lights. The wind roared, tugging at Lyselle's hair, swirling it around her slender frame. She winced every time she inhaled, her eyes shining with pain. Caleb felt a surge of protective instinct. He realized how quickly he had come to care about her well-being. This wasn't just about being forced into her monarchy crisis. He genuinely didn't want anything to happen to her. "My duty is to protect you, my lady." Reluctantly, she nodded. With Caleb's help, she rose. They fled out a side passage that Tovan indicated, leaving him behind. She led Caleb into a labyrinth of maintenance tunnels, the overhead strobe still flickering. Every step she took seemed to sap her strength, but she pressed on. Her injuries were less dire than Tovan's, but the blow from the rifle had cracked something in her side. They stumbled across the catwalk and down a spiral staircase, descending into the night. At last, they reached a small private hangar. Inside was a sleek, compact spaceship, its hull reflecting the neon signage from beyond the open hangar doors. Lyselle coughed, leaning on the railing. Caleb rushed to support her. She tried to wave him off, but he wasn't having it. He slipped an arm around her waist, feeling the warmth of her body through the tight suit. She hissed in pain, though not at his touch, rather at the jostling of her injuries. "Let me hack the console," he said. "We can override the launch restrictions." She nodded, her cat ears drooping slightly. He guided her to a crate where she could sit, then sprinted to the hangar control panel. He rummaged for wires, splicing them with an all-purpose bridging tool. The system was advanced, but not beyond his ability to bypass. The screen flickered, then beeped acceptance. The hangar doors began sliding open wider, revealing the star-strewn sky. Overhead, the city's blinking lights framed a route to freedom. A hiss behind him made him turn. Lyselle had taken a few shaky steps forward. Her golden eyes were wide with alarm. A mercenary stood at the top of the staircase, aiming a rifle directly at them. Caleb's heart lurched. He lunged for the gun he'd pulled off the soldier earlier, but it was too far away. Before the mercenary could fire, the searing sound of a blaster echoed through the hangar. The mercenary dropped to his knees, then collapsed. Through the swirling smoke, Caleb glimpsed a figure on a higher walkway. The old woman. Cloaked in tattered robes, she lowered the small sidearm she had just fired, giving Caleb a penetrating look. Even from across the distance, he could feel the weight of her stare. She inclined her head, as if in silent approval, and then vanished. Caleb let out a slow breath. He helped Lyselle into the ship. The cockpit was cramped, lined with alien script. She took the pilot seat, her posture rigid with pain, but she refused to relinquish control. Caleb slid into the co-pilot seat, fumbling with the foreign controls. She pressed a sequence of glowing symbols, bringing the engines to life. The craft rose, dust swirling beneath it, and launched into the night. Caleb's heart pounded as the city lights fell behind them. Once they broke through the atmosphere, Lyselle let out a trembling sigh. She glanced at Caleb, then leaned back, her whiskers drooping as exhaustion washed over her. Blood stained a portion of her suit near the ribs. He reached over, flicking a few switches to stabilize their course. "You're hurt. We need to tend that wound," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. She nodded, but didn't speak. The weight of their escape pressed down on them, along with the uncertain future ahead. Caleb guided the ship into a safer trajectory, then eased out of his seat to rummage through the emergency medkit. He found bandages and a small tube of antiseptic. Her cat ears twitched in mild discomfort as he carefully peeled back a torn section of the tight suit. The sight of her deep blue flesh, bruised and cut, ignited a flicker of anger within him. The mercenaries would have killed her without hesitation if they had the chance. Her voice was quiet when she spoke. "I can do it myself." He ignored her protest, gently dabbing the wound. "Let me help. You've done plenty to keep us alive." She winced at his touch, but didn't pull away. He was hyper-aware of the proximity. He could feel her warmth, smell a faint floral scent beneath the sterile tang of antiseptic. Despite the pain, her golden eyes remained on him. He felt the tension radiating off her, and not just from physical hurt. Vulnerability wasn't something she was used to showing, he realized. Yet here she was, letting him tend her wounds, trusting him even though they'd met barely a day ago. When he finished bandaging her, he lingered, his hand resting near her waist. Her gaze traveled over his features, taking in the faint stubble on his jaw, the lingering worry in his eyes. She reached out, her slender fingers touching the faint scar over his eyebrow, then drifting down to trace another on his forearm. The motion was gentle, almost reverent. He swallowed, feeling a rush of heat to his cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered. There was more emotion in those two words than he'd heard from her yet. He nodded, throat tight. The silence was loaded with tension, not the hostile kind they'd just escaped, but an intimate, fragile awareness of each other. Her cat ears flicked slightly, as though she was uncertain how to handle the moment. Carefully, he lifted his other hand and brushed a strand of her vibrant blue hair behind one of those ears. She closed her eyes, leaning into the touch. Something in him cracked open at her vulnerability. Without conscious thought, he leaned forward, pressing his lips to her forehead. She inhaled sharply, eyes still closed, and then she turned her face up, meeting his gaze. Their lips brushed, once softly. Despite the lingering adrenaline, everything felt slow and deliberate. Another press of lips. Then she parted them slightly, letting him taste the warmth of her breath. His heart hammered at the closeness, the bizarre yet magnetic feeling of her alien features, the faint texture of whisker markings near her cheeks. He could feel her tension unravel. One of her hands slid around his neck, drawing him nearer. He let himself sink into the moment, ignoring the ship's console beeping a reminder about autopilot. Her mouth was soft, pliant against his. The heat of her body, even in the battered suit, sent sparks through him. Yet beneath that spark was something deeper, relief, gratitude, a shared moment of vulnerability that made them press closer. In that hush, the weight of the throne, the mercenaries, the monarchy crisis and his own insecurities receded. For just a heartbeat or two, they were two souls clinging to each other in the vastness of space. When they finally parted, breathless, she lowered her gaze, whisker markings glowing faintly. "That was unexpected," she murmured, but there was no regret in her tone. He brushed a thumb over her cheek, feeling the warmth. "I guess we both needed it." She nodded. They stayed like that for a few moments longer, hearts pounding in sync, until the beep of the console became insistent. Caleb sighed, pressing one last tender kiss to her temple. Then he rose, returning to the co-pilot seat to check their flight path. She composed herself, slipping back into her guarded persona, but the lingering softness in her expression told him this barrier between them had been permanently lowered. He set the autopilot to take them toward the jump gate that would lead them into the Elenari sector. According to Lyselle, her home star system had numerous contested planets, with multiple factions vying for control. Some believed she, as the rightful heir, should reclaim the throne. Others believed a new order should emerge from the chaos that had followed the death of her mother. As they soared through the darkness, he found himself both excited and terrified at the prospect of being dragged into what sounded like a civil conflict on a scale he'd never imagined, yet a part of him felt alive. They arrived near the jump gate a day later. The trip gave them time to rest and talk, forging a deeper understanding. She revealed that her mother had been assassinated by unknown agents a year ago, an act that had shattered the monarchy. Lyselle had been raised from birth to be a figurehead, yet she despised how every relationship felt like a political move. She had never known genuine closeness that wasn't tainted by power struggles. He told her of his own youth, the years he'd spent drifting from colony to colony, never quite finding a place. He admitted how he felt overshadowed by the geniuses and daredevils out there, that he feared dying without leaving a trace. The honesty felt raw, yet she listened without judgment, her cat ears moving in subtle ways that indicated empathy, whiskers twitching as he laid his insecurities bare. When they finally dropped out of hyperspace near her home system, the view of the main planet, Elendar Prime, filled the ship's screen. Swirling teal clouds and silver oceans sparkled below. Caleb sensed her tension skyrocket. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, feeling the trembling beneath the taut suit. She nodded her thanks. They made contact with a loyalist outpost in orbit. At first, communications were frosty. Then Lyselle identified herself, and the outpost staff fell into formal declarations of loyalty. Caleb watched her face as she responded, her voice poised and commanding despite her nerves. A shuttle escorted them down to the planet's surface, where they were greeted by a handful of armed Elenari guards, each with cat ears and sleek forms like hers, though with various hues of blue and purple skin. They bowed to her, calling her Princess Lyselle. Caleb's heart thumped at the reminder that the woman he'd just held in his arms was, in fact, royalty. The palace they brought her to was a staggering structure of crystalline arches and shimmering spires. The interior glowed with a subtle bioluminescence, reminiscent of the swirling markings on Lyselle's own body. Winding corridors led to a grand hall supported by columns shaped like twisting vines. It would have been awe-inspiring were it not for the tension saturating the air. Guards whispered about possible assassins. The court had been fractured. Rival claimants lurked in the wings. Caleb felt decidedly out of place, his dusty jacket and boots stark against the finery around him. Yet everywhere he went, eyes followed him. Whispers told him that word of the human champion had already spread. They were escorted to a private suite to rest. Once alone, Lyselle sank onto a plush seat with a heavy sigh. Caleb approached, kneeling beside her. He placed a hand on her knee, looking up at her worried eyes. Despite the grandeur, she seemed smaller somehow, weighed down by the burden thrust upon her. "What happens now?" he asked. She swallowed. "The formal challenge for the throne will begin. I will have to prove my rightful claim through trial, negotiation, and, if necessary, combat. Traditionally, I would present a consort or champion as part of that claim, a demonstration of alliances formed by ancient customs. My grandmother's involvement has forced you into that role, though it was not entirely her choice. She claims it was fate." A wry smile tugged at Lyselle's lips. "I never believed much in fate, but here we are." He nodded slowly, pushing aside the surge of disbelief that threatened to unravel him. "If you want me to be your champion, I will. But if there's someone else—" She laid a finger against his lips. "No. If I must do this, I want it to be someone I trust, someone who sees me as more than a title." Her cat ears lowered in a shy gesture. "I never asked for any of this, and I don't want to drag you into danger. But I can't deny, you make me feel less alone." He pressed his forehead to hers, closing his eyes. Her hair brushed his cheeks, and the faint, purr-like vibration rumbled through her chest. "We'll face it together," he said. In the following days, they navigated the labyrinth of Elenari court politics. Caleb discovered that Lyselle's grandmother, who had been the cloaked old woman on Triara, was known here as the Dowager Matriarch. Her reasons for venturing off-world disguised were shrouded in secrecy. Many in the palace revered her, but others whispered that she was cunning and manipulative, orchestrating events from behind the scenes. Caleb could never pin down her motives. Whenever he crossed paths with her, she offered him a slight smile and studied him as though trying to read his soul. The threat of the rival faction, led by a powerful Elenari lord named Savrek, loomed. Savrek was rumored to have arranged Lyselle's mother's assassination to destabilize the monarchy. His primary claim was that Lyselle was too young, too inexperienced, and too influenced by outsiders to rule. Now, with Caleb in the picture, Savrek had fresh ammunition. Court gossip swirled that Lyselle was consorting with a human, some upstart opportunist, a nobody from the frontier. One evening, in a moonlit courtyard where luminescent flowers opened their petals to the night air, Lyselle sat with Caleb. The soft glow of the blossoms highlighted the tension in her posture. They had just come from a council meeting where Savrek's supporters had threatened to call for a trial of ascension, an ancient test of leadership that involved symbolic duels and cunning feats. It was a tradition rarely invoked, but Lyselle had no choice. To claim the throne, she would have to face it. She looked at Caleb, her gold eyes reflective in the dim light. If I fail this trial, there will be civil war. I can't let that happen. He reached for her hand, interlacing their fingers. Then we do whatever it takes to make you win. You're not alone. Her cat ears tilted downward in anxiety. Then she let out a soft breath, whiskers twitching. I'm terrified, she admitted. Not just for me, but for my people, for what this conflict might turn into. And for you. He traced circles over her knuckles. I'm not going to pretend I'm not scared, but I'm committed to seeing this through. Her gaze shifted, and she leaned in closer, resting her forehead against his. When their lips finally parted, she guided him deeper into the courtyard, away from prying eyes. A gentle hush enveloped them as they sank onto soft moss, half hidden by flowering vines. Her cat ears quivered with anticipation, and the faint glow of her whisker markings emphasized the shape of her cheeks. They lost themselves in an embrace that went beyond mere comfort. Her slender hands curled around the back of his neck, pulling him to her. I've never let myself rely on anyone before, she whispered, but you're the first person who's made me feel seen. He responded by pressing a tender kiss to her lips. She parted them with a quiet sigh, and he deepened it, letting the moment soothe them both. Her grip tightened, nails lightly digging into his back, but he welcomed the closeness. The stars overhead felt infinite, the night air thick with the scent of alien blossoms. The pearl-like vibration in her chest intensified, reverberating against him. He brushed his lips along the line of her jaw, tasting the warmth of her skin. She arched against him, her tight suit stretched taut over every inch of her. The hunger in her kiss told him she needed this closeness as badly as he did. They sank further into the soft greenery, limbs entangled, heartbeats hammering. The sound of their quickened breaths mingled with the rustle of the nocturnal breeze. As the heat between them rose, they let go of the day's pressures. His hands traced the curve of her waist, feeling the tension gradually melt from her muscles. She responded with a soft moan, pressing her body into his. A surge of warmth pulsed between them, a silent promise of intimacy. When they reached the threshold of letting their passion consume them, he pulled her more tightly against his chest, and she exhaled a trembling breath. Wordlessly, they agreed to a hush of deeper intimacy, a moment that overcame speech. The next seconds blurred as they yielded to each other, fading into the darkness of the garden. Time felt suspended. Their hands and lips explored gently, reverently, until the closeness peaked in a rush of shared sensation. They clutched each other as if grounding themselves against the tide of uncertainty that awaited them outside this private haven. Later they lay side by side, her head on his chest, the starlit sky shimmering above them. His mind drifted to the challenges ahead, but for now he let contentment fill him. She pressed a lingering kiss to his jaw, her gold eyes heavy-lidded with warmth. The moment felt quietly transformative, as though they had forged a bond that would not easily be broken, no matter who or what threatened them. In the following week, formal announcements were made. The trial of ascension would be held in a sprawling arena that had once served as a ceremonial battleground for the Elenari. Savrek reveled in the chance to publicly challenge Lyselle's right to rule, especially now that she had chosen a human champion. Rumors abounded that he would attempt to sabotage the trial. Though the monarchy had certain rules and rights, unscrupulous means were hardly off the table. Lyselle and Caleb prepared as best they could. She introduced him to the intricacies of Elenari traditions. He spent hours with palace archivists, learning old legends about champions who had proven themselves worthy, gleaning bits of tactical wisdom. Meanwhile, he tinkered with his jamming devices and shield generator, refining them for a real confrontation. Their personal relationship also grew. Snatched hours of intimacy in hidden corners of the palace gave them solace. He discovered that when she felt safe, her purr was deeper, more melodic, often accompanied by playful flicks of her cat ears. She learned that his finger-tapping habit meant he was anxious or thinking through a problem. Sometimes she would place her hand over his to still the motion, and he'd realize just how comforting her presence had become. But the shadows lurking in the palace corridors only lengthened. Savrek's men prowled the halls, and Lyselle's grandmother continued to watch from behind the scenes. Late one night, Caleb overheard a whispered conversation near the throne room. The dowager matriarch was speaking to a cloaked figure, her voice low. Caleb couldn't catch all the words, but he gleaned enough. They were worried about a prophecy that the union of a human and an Elenari princess could either herald a new era or plunge them into ruin. Tall spires ringed the battlefield, and overhead, translucent domes soared, making the arena feel like an ancient cathedral. At the center, a dais rose from the polished stone floor. Lyselle, adorned in regal black and cobalt ceremonial attire that clung to her body, stepped forward to present herself to the gatherers. Caleb stood at her side, his shield generator strapped securely to his forearm, and a newly forged blade at his hip. Though such talk seemed mystical, it reminded Caleb just how precarious their situation was. He refused to let superstition deter him. All that mattered was standing by Lyselle. At last, the day of the trial arrived. The arena was a sprawling circular structure set amid shimmering waterfalls. Thousands of Elenari spectators filled the stands. Cat ears perked in anticipation, eyes glinting with curiosity and malice in equal measure. The hush of the crowd pressed on them, the weight of centuries-old tradition making Caleb's nerves prickle. Across the dais, Savrek entered with a sneer, wearing fine robes that accentuated his muscular build. His ear fur was shorter, a deeper blue than Lyselle's, and a scar zigzagged down his cheek. The trial began with a series of formal recitations of lineage. Lyselle kept her chin high, though Caleb could sense the tension in her posture. Savrek then declared that an untested princess was unfit to rule, and that her human champion was a mockery of tradition. Lyselle countered with a speech about unity and the need to embrace the changing galaxy. The crowd seemed divided, some cheering her words, others jeering. Caleb felt anger simmer inside him, though he kept it under control. In the second stage of the trial, both claimants had to demonstrate leadership by navigating a gauntlet of illusions, a test of cunning and composure. Lyselle and Caleb entered a labyrinth conjured by the palace's advanced biotechnology. The corridors shifted, shapes flickered, illusions taunted them. Caleb's improvised tech scanned for energy fluctuations, revealing hidden passages. Lyselle's heightened senses let her detect subtle cues in the illusions, from the smell of ozone to the faint hum of the environment's power core. They worked in tandem, their synergy forging a path through the gauntlet. Savrek had a fierce warrior from his faction named Zevar, who wore spiked armor and bore a massive, crackling energy sword. The crowd roared as the pair of champions faced off. Zevar lunged with inhuman speed. Caleb, pulse hammering, activated the shield generator. He managed to deflect the blow, sparks flying as sword met barrier. He wove around the platform, peppering the air with small pulse blasts from a sidearm, but Zevar's armor absorbed them. At one point, illusions taunted Lyselle with apparitions of her mother's death. She faltered, tears shining in her gold eyes. But Caleb stood beside her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Together, They pressed on and emerged from the labyrinth triumphant. Savrek too emerged, though battered and furious. The next stage was combat. They stepped onto a circular platform ringed by bright glyphs. The rules were that each claimant could have one champion. Lyselle had Caleb. As the battle raged, Lyselle and Savrek circled each other, exchanging verbal barbs. Savrek tried to corner her, ridiculing her reliance on an off-worlder. Her ears flattened in anger, but she refused to strike prematurely. Instead, she waited for the moment Zevar overextended, and then she sprang into action, sliding behind him to sweep his leg with a swift kick. Caleb took advantage of the opening, delivering a jab to Zevar's midsection. The blow staggered him, but his armor shorted out Caleb's shield with an energy discharge, hurling him backward. Stunned, Caleb tasted blood in his mouth. Zevar advanced, raising the sword for a fatal strike. Suddenly, Lyselle leapt between them, her body twisting gracefully. Her claws raked across Zevar's sword arm, leaving luminous gashes. He roared in pain, and Savrek snarled, lunging at Lyselle from behind. Caleb forced himself up, tackling Savrek's legs. The four of them clashed in a chaotic dance of swings and parries, the entire time the crowd roaring. At last, using the synergy they had honed, Lyselle and Caleb struck in unison. She swept Savrek's blade aside, while Caleb landed a blow on Zevar's unprotected side. Zevar dropped, groaning, sparks flying from his battered armor. Savrek retreated, teeth bared in a feral hiss. Savrek's supporters jeered, but it was clear the momentum had shifted. The Watchers recognized Lyselle's skill and the bond she shared with her champion. Before Savrek could yield, however, an explosion rocked the arena. A hidden device somewhere among the stands detonated, sending shrapnel raining down. The crowd screamed and scrambled. Caleb looked around in horror. People were hurt. The dais shook. Lyselle's eyes darted around, her ears swiveling to locate the source. Overhead, the translucent dome cracked. Then from one of the spires, a squad of mercenaries rappelled down on cables, clearly loyal to Savrek. All illusions of a fair trial vanished as the mercenaries opened fire. Lyselle cried out for the guards to protect the civilians. Caleb darted to the edge of the platform, pulling out a short-range disruptor he'd rigged specifically for sabotage attempts. He tried to jam the mercenaries' gear, but their technology was better than he expected. He only partially disrupted their communications. They began to converge on Lyselle, ignoring the wounded. Savrek joined them, seeing a chance to finish her once and for all. Lyselle's grandmother, the dowager matriarch, appeared in the stands, her aged figure somehow stately amid the chaos. She raised a hand, rallying loyal guards to contain the breach. The conflict escalated with shouting, blaster fire, and the sickening hum of energy blades. Fear clutched at Caleb, but so did resolve. He had come too far to let them snuff out Lyselle's rightful rule here. He found Lyselle kneeling beside an injured guard, pressing a hand to his wound. She looked up at Caleb, anguish etched across her feline features. "I can't let them destroy everything," she whispered, tears brimming in her gold eyes. "My mother's legacy will die if this becomes open war." He clutched her shoulders, staring into her eyes. "We stop them together. You lead, I fight. But you don't let fear guide you. You are stronger than that." A new wave of mercenaries dropped in, forming a ring around them. Savrek stepped forward. "End this farce," he snarled. He lunged for Lyselle. She sprang up, blocking with an elegant slash of her claws. Caleb dashed to intercept the other mercenaries. They outnumbered him 6-1, but he used every trick in his hacking arsenal, overloading weapons, short-circuiting armor, forcing them to fight at a disadvantage. Each time his shield generator flickered from a strike, he felt raw panic, but he gritted his teeth and kept going. He'd never fought like this in his life, and adrenaline thrummed through his veins. Meanwhile, Lyselle and Savrek circled each other in a deadly dance. His blows were heavy, enhanced by a stolen energy device. She relied on agility. her cat-like reflexes letting her dodge. The crowd parted, giving them space, half in terror, half in awe. The final stage of the monarchy's conflict played out in raw violence. Savrek made a powerful strike at Lyselle's midsection. She twisted away, but not fast enough. The blade tore a strip from her attire, grazing her side. Blue blood welled up, and she hissed in pain. The momentary distraction let him close in. He was bigger, stronger, sneering as he pinned her arm. She struggled, whisker markings glowing bright with her fury. He raised his weapon for a killing blow. Caleb, having finally downed the last mercenary, saw the opening he needed. Heart pounding, he sprinted across the dais, ripping a small plasma charge from his belt. He hurled it at Savrek's weapon arm. The device latched on magnetically, and in a burst of sizzling energy, it shorted out the blade. Startled, Savrek lost his grip for a heartbeat. Lyselle seized that moment. She wrenched her arm free, flipping him onto his back, her claws at his throat. He glared up at her, eyes wide with hatred, as the entire arena fell silent. She could have killed him then, ended the threat forever. Her chest rose and fell rapidly. Caleb stood behind her, ready to intervene if needed. Yet Lyselle slowly retracted her claws. "Enough," she said, voice echoing with regal command. "The monarchy endures through justice, not murder. You will answer for your crimes, Savrek." Guards surged in, weapons ready, taking Savrek into custody along with his battered mercenaries. A hush rippled over the stands. Caleb sank to his knees, exhausted, relief coursing through him. Lyselle wavered, blood staining her side, but she remained upright, chin lifted. The dowager matriarch descended onto the dais with surprising swiftness for her age, her robes trailing behind her. She bowed slightly to Lyselle, then turned to address the crowd in a thunderous voice that belied her frail appearance. She formally acknowledged Lyselle's victory, recognizing her as the rightful queen of the Elenari. The arena erupted in roars, half in triumph, half in begrudging acceptance. But it was done. In the chaos that followed, medics rushed to tend the wounded. Caleb helped Lyselle to a quieter corner of the dais. His arms circled her waist as she sagged against him, her cat ears pinned back in pain and fatigue, her whiskers trembling. He pressed a soothing kiss to her temple. She clung to him, burying her face in the crook of his neck. They shared a brief, trembling moment of private relief. Later, in the aftermath, the monarchy's loyalists moved swiftly to restore order. Savrek's supporters either fled or surrendered. Caleb and Lyselle found themselves in the palace's grand medical wing, where her wound was properly treated. Despite protests from the staff that she should remain in bed, she insisted on returning to the throne room. The formal coronation was arranged within days. As soon as she was steady enough to walk, she stood in the radiant hall, wearing a deep blue ceremonial gown that glimmered like starlight. Caleb, awkward in a new set of attire he'd been provided, observed from the sidelines, heart swelling with pride. The dowager matriarch, with a wry glint in her aged eyes, presided over the ceremony. She placed a glowing crest upon Lyselle's chest, signifying her status as queen. The crowd bowed. Then, to Caleb's astonishment, Lyselle beckoned him forward. He stepped up to the dais, uncertain what to do with his hands. She took his hand in hers, presenting him to the assembly as her consort protector and official champion. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but no one objected outright. They all had seen how he stood by her side in the fight. That night, a quieter but far more personal ceremony took place in Lyselle's private chambers. She dismissed the guards from her ornate door. The room was softly lit by shimmering orbs, casting dancing shadows on the curving walls. A set of tall windows overlooked the palace gardens, and in the distance, the twin moons of Elendar Prime rose, bathing the landscape in silver. Lyselle wore a simpler gown, its fabric hugging her slender form. She moved toward Caleb, cat ears flicking up in a rare display of nervousness. He reached out and ran his hand down her arm. "How are you feeling, Your Majesty?" he teased gently. She gave him a light swat with her tail. "Don't call me that when we're alone." Her whiskers curled with a playful hint. "Here, I'm just Lyselle, and you're more than a champion. You're important." He smiled, heart pounding. "I'm not sure what the future holds, but I'm here, with you." She gazed at him, eyes soft as molten gold. "I need to know that, no matter the burdens of ruling, we will walk this path together." Her voice trembled with raw honesty. He nodded, drawing her close. "I choose you, Lyselle, in every way." Tears glistened at the corners of her eyes. She tilted her face up, capturing his lips in a slow, deliberate kiss. This time, there was no rush of adrenaline from battle, only the sweetness of shared victory and the promise of a future they could shape together. Their hands explored once more, unhurried, reacquainting themselves with each other's bodies now that the spectre of war was gone. He felt her warmth envelop him, from the brush of her tail along his leg to the hum in her chest that was part purr, part contented sigh. When their breathing grew ragged, the lights seemed to dim of their own accord, offering them privacy. She led him to the bed, silken sheets parted, and they sank into an intimate hush. Their embrace was unhurried, yet filled with a deeper yearning than before, a celebration of survival and love. They held each other close until the final hush enveloped them, bodies entwined, hearts at peace. They shared whispers between kisses, fears laid to rest, hopes for a kingdom that embraced unity, dreams of bridging cultures beyond the Elenari's reach. As the night deepened, they let passion guide them again, sealed by the bond they had forged through hardship. The details of the world fell away, replaced by the press of her lips, the arch of her back, and the soft moan that escaped her throat when he traced the faint scars on her side. The warmth they shared glowed in the darkness, a silent testament that they had finally found a home in each other. When morning came, the rays of Elendar Prime's rising sun painted the sky with vibrant teal and gold. Caleb stirred, blinking away sleep. Lyselle lay beside him, her long blue hair fanned across the pillows, her cat ears relaxed, her whiskers gently curved. She looked at him with a tender smile that stirred a tide of affection in his chest. Slipping from the bed, they dressed quietly, exchanging soft touches and murmured words about the future. Outside, the city bustled with renewed hope. The gloom of civil strife lifted. People were eager for stability, for a queen who had proven her right to rule in front of them all. That morning, Lyselle officially addressed the crowd from a palace balcony. By her side stood Caleb, no longer an outsider, but a recognized figure in Elenari society. He tapped his fingers lightly at his side as she spoke, a vestige of anxiety that never fully vanished. Yet he felt a calm sense of purpose. Her speech promised reforms, openness to alliances, and an end to the cycle of vengeance that had plagued their monarchy. In the cheers of the crowd, in the brightening sky, Caleb glimpsed the shape of a tomorrow that held promise. When the formalities concluded, she turned to him, her gold eyes alive with affection. He laced his fingers through hers, their hands fitting easily, naturally. In that gesture they stood as one before her people. The hush that fell was laden with awe, but also acceptance. After the crowd dispersed, they slipped away to the palace gardens, walking among the luminescent blossoms that had once bore witness to their earlier confessions. He drummed his fingers on her wrist idly, a habit she indulged with a soft purr. At a bench beneath a tree, whose leaves shimmered in layered shades of blue and silver, they paused. She leaned against his shoulder, pressing a gentle kiss to his neck. He spoke, voice hushed. "I never thought I'd find meaning this way. On Triara, I was just a drifter. I helped your grandmother across the street, thinking it was a simple act of kindness. Now, here I am." She smiled, whiskers crinkling. Sometimes fate hides in the smallest actions. I never imagined trusting someone so quickly. You're the first to want me for who I am, not for my crown. He stroked the back of her hand with his thumb. I do want you, Lyselle. And not just for today. She turned to face him fully, eyes shining. Let our bond be more than a tradition then. Let it be a promise. He nodded, heart brimming with certainty. The final traces of his old self-doubt floated away like leaves on the breeze. He had found something worth fighting for, someone worth standing by, and in turn she had discovered the courage to open her heart without fear of betrayal. They sealed that vow in a long, soulful kiss that tasted of hope. As the sun rose higher, drenching the garden in warm light, they remained on that bench, quietly discussing the shape of their life together. There was no urgent threat now, no looming war. Savrek was imprisoned, his forces disbanded. The monarchy stabilized under Lyselle's rule. Caleb's role remained fluid, part consort, part advisor, part engineer. In time he might champion her cause as they reached out to neighboring star systems, forging new alliances. Yet for the moment, they reveled in the calm after the storm, the peace they had earned. Finally they rose and returned to the palace, walking side by side. Guards saluted Lyselle, but she waved them off with a relaxed smile. The corridors, once rife with tension, now felt bright and open. Servants bustled about, eyes flicking to the new queen and her human consort with cautious curiosity. But respect was clear in their bows and subdued greetings. Lyselle escorted Caleb to the throne room, now repaired from the damage of recent conflicts. Sunlight streamed through high windows, catching on polished floors. At the far end of the room stood the ornate throne that once belonged to her mother. She paused, inhaling slowly, then ascended the steps. Caleb remained at her side. She eased down onto the throne, her posture queenly, cat ears tilted forward as though listening to the silent echoes of the past. Then she lifted her gaze to meet his. He stepped closer, laying a hand over hers. Leaning toward him, she murmured, "From a scavenger's dream to my champion, from my champion to my love, this is our story now." He traced a gentle line along her cheek, feeling the softness of her whiskers. "And this is our ending right here, together." No doubts lingered. No spectre of unfinished business hung in the air. Savrek's defeat was final. The monarchy's seat was secure. They had chosen each other, forging a bond that transcended worlds. She stood from the throne, took his hand, and together they walked from the dais. A swirl of courtiers bowed, parting to let them pass. As they made their way down the corridor, Lyselle's tail curled around his waist in a playful, possessive gesture. He laughed softly, pressing a kiss to her temple. Ahead, the palace doors opened onto a spacious balcony with a breathtaking view of the capital city. The waterfalls gleamed, and the spires caught the sunlight, reflecting it in dazzling patterns. The world lay below them, full of possibilities, yet for once the future wasn't weighed down by dread or tension. It felt open, bright, a place where they could freely carve out a life. They stepped onto the balcony, side by side. He drummed his fingers in a steady, content rhythm against the balustrade. She noticed, slipping an arm around his waist, letting her cat ears brush his cheek affectionately. In the breeze, her blue hair shimmered, a living current of color that reminded him of how she had first appeared in that market alley on Triara, fierce and mesmerizing. Together, they gazed at the horizon. At length, she turned her face to his, eyes shining gold in the sunlight. "We have a lifetime to shape the fate of my people," she said softly, "and I have a lifetime to discover the man you are. Thank you for every moment we've shared." He rested his forehead against hers, feeling her gentle purr resonate. "No, thank you, for giving me a place in all this, for showing me I could be more than I ever believed." Her lips brushed his in a lingering kiss. The entire city spread out before them, the hush of the waterfalls adding a gentle soundtrack to the final scene of their journey. There were no more battles to fight, no more conspiracies in the shadows. They had chosen each other, standing in the light of a new day. And as they held each other close, the future promised not a cliffhanger, but the contented unfolding of a love and a reign they had earned with passion, bravery, and above all, kindness. Kindness that began with a simple act of helping an old woman across the street, a moment that changed both their destinies forever.